So this evening, we will firstly hear from the Honourable John Anderson, and then I will engage John and Jim in a panel conversation. We'll then hear a brief message from our state directors to apply what has been said to the current reality, and then we'll have a time of Q&A. So for the Q&A, please use the Q&A function, which should be at the bottom of your Zoom box. It might appear in the More button, the 3 dots, that's where it is for me. And so you can locate that, have a look now. So send in your questions at any time. You can send them from now all the way through. I won't be asking them in the first panel session. I'll ask them at the end after the state directors have spoken. So you'll have plenty of opportunity to think about a good question and then put it in the Q&A chat box, not the chat box, the Q&A box. So, Honourable John Anderson, thank you so much for your time this evening. Thank you for your sacrifice and leadership in our nation. Thank you for being bold enough to appear at an ACL event during these culturally challenging times. Appreciate your insights, and over to you.
Well, Michelle, thank you very much indeed, and congratulations on your first anniversary. Well done. I hope you have many more. And great to be here with Jim, who's, I was tempted to say an old friend. I'll say a long-term friend. We've been friends for many, many years. And to all of you who are tapped in tonight, I salute you. Thank you for what you're seeking to do in your community and for your nation. We are, whether we like it or not, at a civilisational moment. Of that, there can be little doubt. I'll say a little more about our civilisational moment now in a moment. But I recently visited my old college at the University of Sydney, and I thought, I don't want them to walk away slitting their wrists. So I told them the story of the so-called Oxford Pledge of 1933. There were 2 pledges, one from Cambridge, which for some reason attracted little publicity, and then one from Oxford, which reverberated around the world in a very significant way. In February 1933, it would have been freezing cold and miserable and probably wet and windy as well. The Oxford Union debated that this House would under no circumstances fight for king and country. In other words, we do not believe that we should be prepared to lay our lives on the line for England and all of the traditions that we've been told are dear, and for the civilization that we are part of. We think that that is a bad idea. And it was passed overwhelmingly by close to 300 votes to 150. As I say, there were shockwaves right around the world. Churchill believed to his dying day that it encouraged Hitler to believe that the decadent West, the divided West, no longer believed in itself, or at least the English-speaking part of the West, and that it was, if you like, degenerate and past it and not worth, in the eyes of its own people, worth defending. That should sound vaguely familiar. Churchill himself wrote only months later, surely in reference to this very event, that any society that does not pass on the story of its culture to its young people, and he specifically mentioned its religious faith and its heroes, always important, heroes, those who have gone before you, that can serve as models and examples. If you're not teaching your faith, if you're not teaching the story of the great ones who have gone before you, you are in effect saying to our young children, your young children, that your culture is null and void, not worth defending, and that leaves young people without a sense of place, purpose, and meaning in life. His words, not mine. He went on to say that this leaves young people open to Karl Marx's dictum that a people who do not know their history are easily persuaded. And of course, it is actually true that in Great Britain in the 1920s and 30s, young people were very easily persuaded. An astonishing number, frightening number of them became admirers of the terrible things that were being experimented with in Soviet Russia, for example. Became traitors to their own country, quite a few of them. But he then went on to say that what happens when a society reaches this point is that you need modern day heroes who will, seeing what is wrong, heroically stand up, bravely argue the case for truth and for justice and for good things based on a proper understanding of what history has taught us about what works and what doesn't work. It was a fairly profound moment, but here's the rub, and the point that I made to young people at the college. It was really, that was February 1933. It was only a few short years ago, later, that, of course, Britain was involved in a struggle for its very survival, standing alone, really, with the backing only of the empire, Canada and America, I suppose India and other places, but not particularly militarily strong. They stood against tyranny alone. And those very young people who had been so unsure when their minds were focused, were up there in their Spitfires, in their Hurricanes, risking their lives and often surrendering them over the skies of London and the southeast, and indeed the Midlands and the industrial centres, defending with 660 fighter planes the English skies against 4,800 Nazi planes. The odds were astonishing, but they did so with determination, with technology, and with leadership. Churchill made the difference. He stood in the void. He stood to plug the gap. He stood courageously. He was in many ways a flawed man. We all are. But none of us would be here on this webinar tonight if he'd not displayed the leadership that the moment demanded, and if those young people really had decided it was not worth fighting for. So that was a civilisational moment. My own father was caught up in it. He volunteered for the AIF in May of 1940, Paddington in Sydney, and enlisted and became an acting sergeant in the 2nd, 3rd anti-tank unit, part of the 9th Division. Rommel, the Desert Fox, the Nazi who was trying to take over Northern Africa and gain access to all of the resources, including oil, energy, and so forth, referred to the 9th Division as the finest fighting men the British Empire had surely ever thrown up. My father was to all but lose his life on the 2nd day of El Alamein. Here is a maquette. I think someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's right. This is what he would have looked like in his shorts with his water canteen, I think they called them in the military, Jim, with his 303 Enfield, believe it or not. You know, I guess I'm getting a bit old now, but as a 17-year-old schoolboy, I not only taught younger people how to fire and maintain and strip and clean a 303, we also instructed them how to use a Bren gun. I can still remember the assembly and the disassembly order. Piston barrel, butt, body, bipod. I'll leave him there where you can see him, perhaps. Now, he was so badly wounded on the 2nd day of El Alamein, very early in the morning, trying to pull a younger man, her dad would have been all of about 24, back into the trenches when he panicked after the Germans found the range, shells going off everywhere, that he was literally given up for dead. And his mates were told he wouldn't see the day through, he wouldn't see the night through. Miraculously, he did. So I grew up with a deep consciousness of how badly things can go wrong when we ignore the old RSL motto that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. Now, of course, that's an old Greco-Roman saying. Somebody can tell me exactly who is accredited with coming up with it. But it's not just a military expression. It applies to saving and preserving all that is good in a culture as well. If you stop defending it, it can collapse. And that has been the story of civilizations down through the ages. All civilizations are fired up by powerful ideas. The better the ideas, the better the civilization will be. But powerful ideas that, whether willingly or not, enjoy widespread support so that leaders can implement their policies and take that society forward. Over time, every civilization that's existed, so far as I'm aware, has started to move away from those core beliefs, started to fracture in its support for them. If you like, the fuel has been slowly drained, not replaced. When that happens to a civilization, you've either got to refuel it with the right fuel, or you keep doing what we're doing, fueling it with fuel that simply doesn't keep a civilization on the move. You can't build a civilization on the beliefs and values that we are inculcating in our culture and amongst our young people. You can't do it. I mean, the evidence is all around you. We've got a civilizational moment. Or the civilization fades away, as so many have. I think the historian Arnold Toynbee argued that towards the end of his life that he'd studied over 20 great civilizations, and they hadn't collapsed as an external takeover problem. That had probably descended on most of them, think the Romans in the end, but they had slowly declined. In fact, my good friend Dennis Prager, I haven't put it up yet, but he said to me in a conversation only a couple of days ago that these things happen in a way that should remind us, or we should be reminded of Ernest Hemingway, who went bankrupt, the great writer. And he was asked, how do you go bankrupt? And he said, very slowly at first, and then it picks up a little bit of speed. And then all of a sudden that happens with frightening speed, and it's all over before you know it. Well, there's no point in us being dishonest. We are at a critical juncture. We face, just as my father's generation did, massive external enemies who believe that we're weak and divided and degenerate. We really have, if you like, 4 loci, 5, I would argue. And this is an insight from Os Guinness. I've been talking to him recently about this. We have China, we have North Korea, we have Iran, we have Russia, but we also now have this extraordinary, very totalitarian in its attitudes, amalgam between radical Islam and woke activists in the West. And then no doubt about the woke activists. They have been highly effective for a long time. They've now found the most terrifying supporters, it would seem. We're seeing that play out on our campuses in America. Here, we're seeing it internationally. Suddenly, it's fashionable, it seems, to be anti-Semitic, the oldest and ugliest form of racism of all. And we suddenly define that woke values, which only a little while ago were burning America down in support of Black Lives Matter, saying we must end racism, we now discover that they tend to be unbelievably racist, and in particular, are great admirers of the oldest and ugliest form of racism of all. Well, they rose up in Britain, and we went with them. America joined in the end, and the free world prevailed. Can it happen again? God willing, of course it can. Will it happen? God only knows. What is our job? Never to give up the hope that Michelle talked about, and to work assiduously for it without fear. Dismay, yes. Intellectually, the challenges are enormous. Emotionally, probably like me, many of you just feel deep offense when you see that every good thing our Heavenly Father has given us is trashed. Everything is under attack. Right from the biblical beginning, He created the man and woman. Everything's under attack. No, how dare some Christian God take precedence over me, for I am God over myself. That is the modern mantra. So we're setting ourselves up to have, in this country alone, 27 million gods all competing with one another for power, rather than seeking to humble themselves before the God and cooperate and pull together. Some positives. You're all here tonight. ACL plays a role. It has a big membership. I know that there have been some ups and downs recently. Good on you for being here tonight. Go out and spread the word. Back in business in a fulsome and full-blooded way, and it matters and it's important. Think tanks around the place, some Christians, some simply sympathetic, some not particularly spiritual at all, but they are beginning to expose the very bad thinking. Remember what I said about civilization is always based around thinking. We are, as a society, all societies are the product of great ideas. They're exposing the bad thinking that is producing terrible policy outcomes. Increasingly, they are pointing the way to better thinking that would produce better policy outcomes, economic, social, if you like, security and defense included. To that end, I'd make a couple of broad comments. One is obviously ARC, and I'm now on the international board of ARC, just 6 of us. We held our first conference in London last year, 1,500 people. It'll be 4,000 for the next one, we hope, in London, February next year. We are going to launch an ARC Australia for those who can't make it all the way over there, and one which will focus on the particular characteristics of the challenges that are global, if you like, but face us in terms of their particularities in this country that need particularly fine-tuned responses. And that great conference essentially considered the challenges before us in 4 broad areas in terms of our culture. We didn't go to geopolitics a great deal. It was there, not greatly publicized, but it was there because we felt that your capacity and your willingness, your intent and your will to defend yourself stems from how you see yourself, the health of your nation. But the 4 great themes were social fabric and family, where we learnt, for example, that family breakup coupled with social media, particularly the advent of screens in playgrounds, smartphones in 2011 and 12 have visited and are visiting immense harm on our children. We had the shock and awe moment of a very articulate MP from Britain advising us that 90% of English teachers report having kindergarten children coming to kindergarten in nappies. And there was a wow moment. Is this what we've got to in terms of what's happening in our homes? A lot of emphasis on anxiety amongst children and a lot of thinking around practical solutions ways forward. Second great stream, energy and the environment. We need to recognize that if we mismanage and we demonize all the things that God has given us, so suddenly fossil fuels, which have lifted countless numbers of human beings out of abject poverty, short, brutish lives, suddenly now worthy only of demonization. We need to get energy and the environment right. Business and prosperity, where increasingly now the marketplace and the economy is being subverted again by centralized governments and by interfering shareholders and so forth using ESG and DIE as clubs to replace the invisible hand of the market and distort investment patterns, which is making us all poorer, exacerbating the cost of living problem. And then our story, which is what we're talking about now, why Christianity matters, why it's the wellspring of Western civilization, why we've got to push back against the demonization of our wellsprings. One final thing to remember, all the research is suggesting that Generation Z, under 26s, are recentering. Young men particularly are recentering, partly because of the overreach, frankly, of the woke. So young men who are constantly told, particularly young white men, if you'll forgive me for using that term, that they are toxic and oppressors simply because they're white, are pushing back very hard. And they're looking for better answers. They're saying, that's a dead-end street for me. I'm going to be blamed in this modern world where you simply have victims and oppressors. And that doesn't work. And so, in response to all sorts of people, including Jordan Peterson, has to be said, who's opened up the field for great debate, they are pushing back. They are recentering. And I think that's extremely encouraging. Michelle, I think I've already overstayed my welcome, just looking at the clock, so I apologize. That's the problem with a former politician, you see. It's a bit like a former crack addict. You show them the wrong thing and they can't put it down. You've given me a microphone. I'm sorry.
It's excellent. No, thank you very much. Just to mention, unfortunately, Jim's an apology because he can't get a stable internet connection out where he is. But John, that was both a reality shock. And I mean, we're all aware of the state of affairs, but when you put it all together like that, it does bring it home, the state that we're in at the moment. But you did encourage us that decline isn't a foregone conclusion. You mentioned about bankruptcy, how it happens very slowly, then it picks up speed, and then at frightening speed. In regard to that analogy, where would you say that we're at this point in history? Are we at the frightening speed point at this time?
We're very, very close to it. I don't think we've entered the death spiral, but we're very close to falling over the edge into that spin that we won't be able to pull out of. I think our basic institutions are still salvageable. Our parliaments are still salvageable. We need to man them with, am I allowed to say that? We're meant to people them with higher quality individuals and more of them and more backup, because this is the age of disengagement. Lord Jonathan Sumption told me in England a couple of years ago that the British Labour Party, for many decades after the Second World War, had had an average of 1.1 million members. The Conservatives 1.9, total of 3. Today, there's more members of the Royal Society of Birdwatchers in the UK. Now, they might be having more fun, but it's really important for people to be engaged, which is what you're about. So we need to step up. But then it applies everywhere else as well. We've got to be actively engaged in all of the other institutions of our society, our churches, to state the obvious, our schools, our universities. It's a long, long way back. But remember, Churchill stood almost alone. What he did have in the Parliament's often forgotten. He was hated by many of his own peers. But when it was obvious he was the one man who'd stand, it was the young MPs that rallied around him, gave him the support he needed in those critical days when the nation finally turned to him and the Parliament embraced him as the Prime Minister.
Yeah, and even looking back on that in situations, events throughout history where we have seen a cultural decline, but then something has happened, like you talk about the Churchill story, and we often reflect on the Wilberforce story of when society got to such a terrible point, so much injustice, corruption, hypocrisy, but then something shifted. Can you provide any insight or reflections into points throughout history where something has shifted, something has changed, and how we can consider that in our situation today?
Well, my favourite, having talked a lot about the 1930s, but my favourite is actually probably 1780s through to about 1833 when William Wilberforce was active. Now, I'm often reminded when I talk about William Wilberforce, I need to emphasise that just like ARC, the Alliance of Responsible Citizens, and like ACL and all good movements, and even Churchill with the young men supporting him, he wasn't alone. He had very wealthy bankers, probably the wealthiest people in the world, the Thornton father and son combination. He had freed slaves. He had genuine intellectuals. He had the Quakers. He had many fine women and so forth joining him in what became known as the Clapham sect, S-E-C-T. I prefer to say set, because sect today sounds like cult. It's equated with something that's horrible and twisted. It wasn't in those days. It just meant a set of people. Now, Britain was unbelievably degenerate and immoral, and it faced massive external enemies, America being one, and it actually lost to America. We forget that, the War of Independence. But then there were the terrors in the 1790s, the French Revolution, which of course became known as the Terror. And it was a time when Britain could very easily have failed, very easily have failed. It was probably the Wesleys, then William Wilberforce and his people, who prevented Britain from succumbing to the massive, violent upheavals that so blighted much of Europe and France in particular. And so the tipping point, well, we know the tipping point. It really was the conversion of one key man. It was William Wilberforce, and he was led to Christ by Isaac Milner, who was a brilliant Oxford mathematician. He was in the Parliament as a young man. He wanted to leave the Parliament because he decided, after he'd been converted, that Parliament was no place for a young man of Christian principle. And it was John Newton, the slave trader, who said, no, you should stay there under God. Seek out your two great jobs, two great tasks God's put before you. And Wilberforce wrote in his diary, God Almighty's put before me two great tasks: the reformation of the English-speaking people's manners, which basically meant corruption and a sick society. I mean, it was sick. You know, they didn't have video porn like we do, but a quarter of the women in London that weren't married were prostitutes. There were free sex shows on every other corner. The king's sons were having their massive gambling debts paid out of the taxes of the people. Corruption was everywhere. Politicians were buying, in other words, stealing elections. It was a terrible time. Anyway, Wilberforce, galvanized, convinced, with the right people around him, turned it around. We need a modern Clapham set or sets. I think really the view I take is that the more fires we can light out on the battlefield at the moment, the better. And of course, ACL is a very, very important one.
Absolutely. There's a line in that when I watched the movie, and I've read every biography about Willie Wilberforce as well, but when he was struggling with that tension between, after he became a Christian, do I go into solitary service and commit my life to serving the Lord, or do I stay in politics? And Hannah More said to him, I humbly suggest you can do both. And that's what we're all called to do. We're called to be out there in the public square, speaking the gospel at the same time as we are serving Jesus. You mentioned the pushback on the anti-men movement, and I have a 14-year-old dominant male in my house, and I want him to feel secure in his male identity. I want him to see himself as protector, as provider. I also want him to be gentle and honoring towards women. But one thing I'm noticing these days is that my boys don't actually rough and tumble with their friends as much as my brothers did when they were young. We're missing sort of that in culture. My husband makes up for that with a bit of rough and tumble at home, but how do we raise boys to become men in a soft culture? How do we make men not feel guilty for being the men who God created them to be?
It's a very good question and a very pressing one. I should reveal I'm patron of the Australian Fathering Project, set up by Professor Bruce Robinson at the University of Western Australia, and it's probably worth Googling because it's a very high quality, practical set of tips and courses and ideas and what have you around this very subject. Fathers play probably the most critical role of all. So it's a real tragedy if their father's not there, but a father figure can make a huge difference. Many of you will be in positions where you can see kids that need a father figure. Can I urge you, those of you on this webinar, if you're in that situation, wherever you can be a father figure or a grandfather figure or whatever, father figure for the kids next door, step up, have a go, be there for them, because we do know the girls will learn, relationship modeling from a respectful man. A boy will learn how to treat women with respect from watching the males that they are copying, and that will always be their father for first choice. Roughhousing turns out to be unbelievably important. A lot of useful tips in the book, The Boy Crisis by Warren Farrell and John Gray. I strongly recommend that, as well as the Fathering Project and its ideas. It turns out that fathers are instinctively much better at raising their children than they think they are, and the culture tells them they are, partly because they're inclined not to overparent, because overparenting, helicopter parenting, can be quite damaging, and partly because in rough and tumble, they will teach give and take. And if they do it the right way, and instinctively many of them will, they will teach delayed gratification. The inability to delay gratification, in other words, to work hard to achieve something in the longer term and not look for it now, not expect it now, not expect others to provide it, is really important. And a lot of it's learnt according to, I can't tell you how much I admire Warren Farrell. I don't think he'd call himself a Christian, but his book is absolutely magnificent. I've got it here somewhere. I could hold it up. Anyway, well worth reading on this subject. And he makes the point that mothers and fathers play very different roles. In London, a couple of you I know were there. He had 3 pictures. They were quite magnificent. It was the father throwing his son up in the air and catching him. Kid squeals with delight. I've seen my son do it with his son. And as dad sees it, and the boy's about that far above the father's head, as the boy sees it, it's like that. But as mum sees it, it's up to the sky. And that tells you something about the different approaches. Mothers are nurturing. That's important. They worry. Dads recognize instinctively that you do need to test your limits a bit, have a go. Now, let me make another point that I can illustrate with 2 people who would not, I don't think, necessarily share the same view of salvation as we might on this webinar. Faced with being told your masculinity is toxic, you can either say, all right, well, if that's it, I'm going for it. I'll be a real misogynist. I'll really misbehave. I'll go for fast cars, fast women, and live my life irresponsibly and become an Andrew Tate. Or you can respond to the very interesting messages that that thousands of young men in the West go to hear from Jordan Peterson. And essentially, he will say, don't think you're the person you ought to be. You're not. None of us are. Go back to your bedroom. make your bed, pull your shoulders back, think through your failings. The more you examine yourself, the more you'll realize you're not the person you ought to be. And at this point, we would say seek forgiveness. He doesn't say that. I don't want to misrepresent him, but he is making a legitimate point. But only then, when you've become the best you can, should you go out and seek to save the world. We now tell kids that you should all be politically involved, and the way to do it is to go and be an activist and smash everything, find a cause. You don't have to understand it, just get on board and be destructive. And it's hopeless.
You said a very controversial statement that mothers and fathers played very different roles. Unfortunately,
well, anyone who attempts to deny that, in my view, is failing to recognise the real and the best interests of the child. Absolutely. And I'm sorry, I can adopt no other position. I've seen it in my own life with my own four, and even now with my grandchildren. And all of the evidence, printed and otherwise, strongly suggests that. And so do the best thinkers. Warren Farrell's not a believer. He's not even from the right side of the political divide. I don't think John Gray is either. He was men are from Mars, women are from Venus, or whichever way it is. And they co-authored this book. I recommend it to you.
Thanks very much. We're going to go to our state directors and then come back to you, John, with some questions from the audience. We've got 706 computers logging on, which is probably well over 1,000 people listening in. So thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. At the ACL, we have an incredible team of state directors who do a really fantastic job building relationships with members of parliament, building and activating our volunteer network, informing and educating churches, providing comment in the media. They often appear before inquiries that are very hostile to them and make a solid defence of truth. Being a state director at ACL isn't a job where you can just sit back and relax and wonder what to do next, because you're always on mission. There's so many fires to fight. So we've got to prioritise those battles that are winnable. But in situations where we know that we won't win, that the terrible piece of legislation is going to pass, we still speak truth because we have to. We can't ignore these things. And we really believe, in terms of speaking about hope, that the truth are seeds, and one day they will sprout. But most unfortunately, the truth is only acknowledged after the consequences of the error is realised, which is what we're speaking about this evening. So it's what we hope to avoid, but sadly, it's a common story throughout history. But I've asked the state directors, in the context of turning the tide, to speak about how they see the tide turning in their state. There is hope on the horizon, and to speak about it relevant to what's happening on the ground. So I know many of you are familiar with our state directors. Sadly, tonight, Rob Norman, our Queensland director, can't join us because he's on a road trip through remote Queensland, spreading the message of all that ACL is doing. And our New South Wales State Director, Joshua Rowe, is actually at home with his wife and newborn baby, Daniel, who is only 4 days old. So sending a lot of love to Joshua and his wife, Celine. So we have Wendy Francis, our National Director of Politics, speaking for Queensland and New South Wales. And Paris, you can bring on the rest to the screen. We have Peter Abetz in WA. We have Ashlyn from South Australia, Jasmine from Victoria, and Christopher, who's representing Tasmania. And then Wendy's going to be up on the screen there too. So hand it over to you guys. Ashlyn, why don't you go first?
Thanks, Michelle. And can I just extend my thanks to John Anderson for speaking with us. I'm a big fan of your Conversations podcast, and a big thank you to everyone who has made it tonight. Well, if we're speaking about hope for change, there are two big issues in South Australia that I see hope for change in this year. And of course, many of you have been receiving a lot of emails on the topic of gender. We're pushing very hard for a gender inquiry here in South Australia, and restrictions on puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones in children. And just an encouragement, there are people from all sides of the chamber and independents who are working very hard for that here. And I do believe the efforts are going to bear fruit. So that's one issue we can praise God for and keep praying for here in South Australia. But the other issue that I want to bring to our attention, where I believe there is a lot of momentum for change and hope for change, is the topic of prostitution. Many of you may know that a couple of weeks ago, so the Wednesday before last, on the 1st of May, a member of our upper house, Nicola Centifanti, put her motion for what's called a Nordic model or an equality model for prostitution law reform to vote. in the upper house, and unfortunately on this occasion it did lose by 1 vote. I was joined by a number of dedicated volunteers and we stayed in the chamber until midnight watching that vote. And while it was disappointing to see that vote not pass, or what it would have done is it would have criminalised the purchase of commercial sex and introduced supports for people in prostitution to exit that industry. I am really encouraged by how the conversation on the topic of prostitution has changed in South Australia in the last few years. And I want to take us back to 2017 and 2019. On both of these years, a full decriminalisation model passed in the very same chamber that we were sitting in on the 1st of May. So in our upper house, decriminalisation passed in our upper house in 2017. Thankfully, it didn't go to our lower house on that occasion due to an election. And then again in 2019, it passed our upper house, but it did not pass our lower house. So that was a great victory. Bring us forward to 2024 and just 1 vote shy of bringing in the Nordic model in South Australia. There were 8 speeches strongly in favour of this approach, and many of them referenced the opportunities that they'd had to meet survivors and experts in the industry, and ACL facilitated those meetings. So you can trace the influence of our advocacy in that area. And John Anderson mentioned the price for freedom is eternal vigilance. We must be vigilant on this issue because there are strong lobby groups, Sex Industry Network being one of them, that have a strategy moving forward to bring in decrim. So let's continue being on the front step or the front foot on this issue. I do believe there's hope for change, and that's my update for South Australia.
Thanks, Ashlyn. Let's go to Peter in WA.
Yeah, in Western Australia, we've been busy on 2 major fronts where there are some really positive signs for change on the horizon. Like all the other states in Australia, our Perth Children's Hospital Gender Clinic uses the now discredited affirmation approach that simply says that a child knows their gender, and that's totally unrelated to anything else going on in their little lives. I've been sending information to all MPs on this subject since the beginning of the year, and whenever an article appears in the media or a medical journal article that's critical of the affirmation approach, I email that to them. And that led to Dr. Brian Walker, who's a medical doctor in the upper house, contacting me and offering to sponsor a parliamentary e-petition. And that e-petition is up on the Parliament website. And I urge all WA supporters who are on tonight, make sure you sign that. Another outcome of this was that the Liberal leader, Libby Mettam, contacted me and wanted more information. And I was able to connect her with some detransitioners and their families who felt bullied by the gender clinic. And this all culminated in Libby Mettam being the first political leader in Australia to call for a full inquiry into gender affirmation treatments. And she's had the courage to actually make that an election commitment. We've got an election coming up in March. So I'm very hopeful that there will be some significant change. The other issue that we've been working on is the right of faith-based educational institutions, charities and churches to continue to be allowed to operate in keeping with the teachings of their faith. And we've been busy seeing our federal MPs, and I've had a briefing from Senator Cash on what is in that legislation. And I've organised small delegations of supporters to meet with their MPs. And most of the MPs actually recognise that Christian schools should be allowed to operate according to their values and ethos. And they've told us that the ALRC report, that's the Labor MPs, tell us the ALRC report is just a report, not a government policy. And they seem to be unaware that the legislation that's been drafted actually fully reflects the ALRC recommendations. So I'm actually hopeful, and I urge everyone to pray for that the Labor government will either drop the legislation or come up with a workable agreement, such as a positive statement that schools operating according to the tenets of their faith aren't engaging in discrimination. There's still a long way to go in that battle for religious freedom, but I'm very hopeful that the extreme recommendations of the ALRC actually won't be implemented.
Thanks, Peter. Let's go to Jasmine in Victoria.
Thank you. Victoria is quiet politically after election and the departure of Dan Andrews. So we are at the moment in the eye of the storm, but we are still dealing with the aftermath of Andrews' storm. However, there are three major issues that we can work towards change. On gender issue, since the WPATH lead files and cast review reports, I'm working closely with a few key MPs pushing the government to commission an independent inquiry into gender transitioning treatments. David Limbrick MP is persistently calling for inquiry, and the Liberal will also support an inquiry when there is one. I'm also getting information from gender clinics and a few government departments under FOI on the specifics of gender treatments, including their spending and government funding. This information, I believe, will help put pressure on the government because Victoria is dealing with skyrocket state debts. On religious freedom, our hope is to repeal the Equal Opportunity Religious Exceptions Law and amend the Change or Suppression Conversion Law. A positive note about this is that the Liberal National Party has committed to repeal the Religious Exceptions Law during the last election. And John Pesutto has given me and our supporters the assurance that he will defend religious freedom and parental rights. As for the conversion law, I will have an opportunity coming up working on a list of proposed amendments. So your prayers will be very much appreciated. The third issue we are working on is education. Victorian education is the root of all evil in our state because of the gender and identity politics indoctrination in our public school. So we have launched a community education campaign in February that aims at exposing the indoctrination one by one. That includes the respectful relationship program, sexuality education, mature minor policy, LGBTIQ student support policy, and doctors at secondary school program. These programs and policies combined have resulted in a surge in students identifying themselves as non-binary and have children referred to gender clinics without parental knowledge. The purpose of this campaign is to raise awareness in the wider community and to inform voters before the next state election. So this campaign is paving the way for us to make a change in Victoria in 2026 election and then put an end on indoctrination at school. So if we don't give up hope and have more Christians rising up to help, we will get there.
Thanks, Jasmine. Nick in Northern Territory.
Thank you. G'day, everyone. In 2022, the NT-Labor government amended the Anti-Discrimination Act, which removed the ability for Christian schools to specifically hire Christian teachers. At the same time, they brought in offence-based laws. So in the Northern Territory, it's now illegal to be offensive in public settings against particular protected attributes, which is not good news for Christians because we know that the gospel is offensive. And as Christians and teachers, we need to be able to publicly teach on some of the issues encompassed by the protected attributes. An example of that would be homosexuality. It is now protected under the new legislation. So if a church publicly spoke on that and someone was offended, they could put in a complaint to the Anti-Discrimination Commission. Though in 2022, this specific issue awoke the churches and Christian schools in the Northern Territory. We had church leaders speaking publicly. We had the NT Christian schools speaking publicly. We had a peaceful prayer rally outside Parliament House in Darwin, attended by hundreds. At this rally, the CLP committed to repealing these amendments if elected in the upcoming August election. This is a big win, and the CLP look like they have an equal chance of winning the upcoming election. So if they did win, we could expect those laws to be repealed. I'm encouraged that the church has become more interested in speaking into important topics in the Northern Territory, and I believe there is real hope for change. I was encouraged by a very recent story. A remote Aboriginal community was experiencing constant warring and violence. A state government in Australia was completely lost about what to do. Through God's will and some lifelong relationships in the church, leaders from a local church in Alice Springs were invited by a state government to help with issues currently being experienced in the community. The pastors from that church went in and ministered to those people and managed to have both the warring families attend and listen to God's word. They got to speak about God's forgiveness through the cross for 3 nights. I am encouraged that an Australian state government, through the Australian state government, church leaders can be brought in to help. These people obviously were salt and light and held that heavenly wisdom that would bring peace to a place of destruction. It wasn't their own wisdom that brought them, but God's. And I pray that this is just one of the first examples of the tide turning. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. It's encouraging. And when, sorry, no, we're going to Christopher in Tasmania.
Thank you, Michelle. In Ezra chapter 1, it says that God stirred the heart of Cyrus to call for the building of the temple. And we're seeing in Tasmania a stirring of the hearts in our political leaders towards, please God, in God's will, to have an inquiry into the whole treatment of sex-confused children. But we're seeing the stirring of a heart of a modern-day hero, Archbishop Julian Porteous. On the 2nd of May, Archbishop Porteous this year published a pastoral letter called We Are the Salt of the Earth. And in it, he rejects the idea that truth is relative. He says truth is absolute. He says that men and women are sexually complementary and were made for each other for marriage, which is indissoluble. He rejects the idea of people being able to choose which sex they are. And he calls on the Albanese government to protect the freedom of Catholic schools, which have to be able to teach the truth, and for all Christian schools. This is one of the most boldest letters of a Christian leader. Expectedly, it's created a firestorm from the Greens, the same-sex activists, some of the left-leaning independents who are calling for complaints to the Anti-Discrimination Commission, etc. But the critical thing is this is a church leader who's exercised freedom to speak into the issues of our day boldly, saying we are salt and light and we are going to speak the truth. And it's a model for all church leadership, not to try to find a softly way through this, but to stand in the gap and speak truth. God has stirred the heart of that man, and may he stir all of our hearts to speak truth. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you, Christopher. Wendy for Queensland and New South Wales.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, everybody. In New South Wales, Joshua Rowe, our State Director, is making significant inroads into Parliament. His attention to detail has seen him become, I would say, a primary source of information for the MPs there on numerous important issues. He has successfully drawn dozens of MPs together quite recently to hear first-hand reports of devastating effects of gender fluid ideology on the New South Wales young people. He's very strong on research, as are all of our state directors. I work closely with them all. Along with our other state directors, Joshua has used freedom of information requests to obtain gender clinic statistics. Now, the New South Wales Maple Leaf House Gender Clinic, this is just one example. They opened just 2 years ago. They recorded 443 new referrals in 2023. That was just in the 1 year. They attended to 938 patients in that clinic in that year. Now, despite that high number of young people, they maintain that they have no data on cross-sex hormone prescriptions and basic patient demographics, including the natural sex of kids who come to them. So when Joshua advises MPs of information such as that, it is very powerful. And he is truly making waves into that Parliament. We're seeing the waves crashing down the foundations that are actually built on sand for what is a straw man of gender ideology. And now in Queensland, there are only 3 sitting weeks left before that Parliament is dissolved for an October election. And despite this, and perhaps actually because of this, the Labor government is determined to push through as much legislation as they can, which seems to remove as much of Christianity as they can, I'm going to say. One of the things they want to do is remove the right of Christian organisations to hire staff according to their faith. But in this current parliament, they have the numbers and there's no upper house. But despite this, there is good reason for optimism in Queensland as well. Firstly, in regards to two recent and particularly awful Labor bills, that one which liberalised prostitution and one which even further liberalised abortion, if that's even possible. But what we found was that I would say, along with others, Rob Norman's advocacy to the LNP meant that the LNP voted as a bloc to oppose those two bills. That is significant for the LNP because they have not always had a backbone, but they managed to vote as a bloc both those bills. So that's significant. I believe we're finding that there's an increasing number of LNP members that are returning to the party's conservative roots, something to be celebrated. Rob has been working tirelessly, building relationships, speaking truth. One of the ways that his work has borne fruit in a collaborative sense is that he has uploaded an e-petition himself. It's an e-petition calling for an independent inquiry into the Queensland Gender Services, but that petition has been sponsored by an MP, a sitting MP. That again is a real achievement. The petition currently has over 7,200 signatures. If you're on this call and you're a Queenslander, I need you to sign that. There is also a bill that's been tabled in our Queensland Parliament for babies, the human rights of babies born alive after abortion to be recognised and for them to receive appropriate care. Now, when this Born Alive bill was actually presented in Parliament, our Parliament, that is a particularly noisy Parliament, I think because we don't have an upper house, it fell into a very rare moment of silence because Robbie Katter, who was presenting the bill, told the House that 90 Queensland newborns had been born alive after abortions in the last 2 years. So if we do the maths, it's pretty frightening. And sadly, those babies don't currently have legislative right to be treated as equals. But we're really optimistic that this new bill will pass. And Rob has had a lot to do with the writing and the preparation for that bill. And if it doesn't pass in this Parliament, it will be carried forward to the next Parliament. We're also seeing some hopeful progress in our national fight for the protection of babies born alive after abortion and left to die, often in tragic circumstances. We have reports, not just reports, we've got coroners' reports of this happening. So in August, we're going to hold our second rally and display of baby booties on the front lawn of Federal Parliament, supporting the Babies Born Alive bill that's been sponsored by Senators Antic, Babet and Canavan. Now, last year, the impact of that day, it's a collaboration and it's lots of things coming together, but certainly that day had an impact of the committee that was examining the Senator's bill at the time was not able, they decided not to make any recommendation. Now, normally there's a recommendation that comes from a committee such as that, but they were unable to make a recommendation for or against the bill. And so we're excited to see what will happen at this year's demonstration, at it and also following it. Later this month, we'll also hold our second event in the Federal Parliament Speaker's Office with Christian charity leaders from around the nation. The Speaker, Milton Dick, is sponsoring our event, and it's going to be hosted by Michelle Pearse, our CEO, but also the guest speaker will be the Charities Minister, Dr. Andrew Lee. And he has agreed for us to bring together Christian charity leaders from around, and he wants to address them, but he will also invite feedback from them, particularly regarding the government's proposed changes to the philanthropic giving and DGR status, that if it was implemented, it would be of serious detriment to Christian schools and charities. And so I'm going to say it because I believe it with all my heart. It's a credit to the work and reputation of ACL that we have the privilege of an opportunity such as this. The Speaker presenting us in his offices, providing morning tea for our guests, inviting Andrew Lee. We have relationships with parliamentarians on both sides of the political divide, and I personally thank God for being able to be part of this great team. So thank you, Michelle, for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Wendy. We talk about babies who survive abortions and then are left to die with no medical care. And, we talk about it a lot, so it's easy just to say it, that when we think about the fact that babies are born alive, babies are surviving abortions, that doesn't speak to to the conscience of the nation. If MPs aren't moved by that, then we really are on that really fast cultural decline that John was mentioning. So this is part of winding back abortion. We have to protect these little precious lives that survive the abortions, and then stop late term and wind it all the way back. John, I'd love to invite you back onto the screen, and we have some really great questions. And this first one I read from Helen, and she provides a comment before the question. I thought it was great. And she says, as an older Australian, she's been in this country as a British migrant from the age of 16. History seems to show us that when we lose our bearings, i.e., as in John Anderson's example of the Oxford Union debate in the 1930s, then we sink into a morass that seems to end in a war situation, hopefully not a future global conflict. However, the enormous impact of such a conflict has, historically, shocked us back into realizing what is really important in life, and it's not material possessions or status, but rather relationships with important people in our lives. Does Mr. Anderson believe the pushback he mentioned will be strong enough to recenter us as a nation, or indeed as a global community?
I sincerely hope so. God only knows whether it will happen. Our job is to believe it can and work furiously towards that end on the basis, as someone reminded me today, Timothy's injunction, that we ought to pray that we be good and quietly governed. God is a God of order. God is a God who would not have people, particularly those who are really the victims of war, marginalised and left hungry and unable to look after their elderly and their babies. The breakdown of a civilization is not a good thought at all. But it is going to be a close run thing, whichever way you look at it. I just say again that we absolutely must keep battling on and do what we can. And I'm going to be really frank and say there are a lot of people who could do a lot more than they are now with their time, with their resources, with their relationships. And I need to direct that to myself as much as anybody else. Can I just add quite a bit of talk about this transgender issue? Dr. Helen Joyce, a former very senior journalist with The Economist in the UK, has provided an outstanding breakdown of the Cass review, Professor Hilary Cass, into the transgender clinics in the UK. Same issue that you've been talking about here in Australia. No research. They pretend to know nothing. They don't know the backgrounds. They don't know the outcomes. They run this line that children who are subjected to some careful non-affirmation, if you like, consultation of the sort that normally accompanies medical issues or precedes medical procedures has not been, is absolutely wrong. There's no evidence to support it at all. It's worth listening to. It really is worth listening to. And even in left Scotland, now there's been an acceptance that these clinics should be closed. Puberty blockers are fraught with danger. And that's a cause for hope on the same subject. You see, you've had that. Britain's managed to turn around its declining educational standards. Ours are still in free fall, for example. There are straws in the wind. There is evidence of a recentering. And I do think our institutions are still fit for purpose as long as we can people them with those who understand Christianity. Having said that, Chris Uhlmann's article in last weekend's Australian warning that the parent no longer recognises the child, or the child doesn't recognise the parent, the idea of the worth and the dignity of all was now given way to the idea that Christianity is the enemy of people who hold that view, and that governments are better off upholding the dignity and worth of all. Well, we know they're not. You take government away from its position over, or God over. When you remove God and from being over government, then government becomes God. And because government's made up of flawed human beings, it's always a disaster.
Absolutely. A few people have written questions about mental health and the way that we use that word. Vivian has said, I have come to believe that the term mental health is a dangerous term that is lumping together spiritual, emotional, intellectual, and emotional health, reducing solutions to medication. How can we, as committed Christians, turn the tide on this?
Well, I think that's a very astute observation. I'm sure it's right. There are those people who suffer from serious mental health in the same way that some do from cancer or heart weaknesses, disease, or whatever. That is undoubtedly true, and we should never lose sight of that. And we should never be harsh in our judgment. It's a good thing that people feel more able to talk about it. But what's now happening is that we're living in an environment where there's an ennoblement of the idea of mental health somehow, that if you've got mental health, you're a victim, and then victims are weaponized, made into an aristocracy, and the emphasis is not on solving the problem or getting to an understanding of what's causing it, so much as somehow, as I say, ennobling it. But I'm absolutely sure that a very large number of people who front with mental health issues do so because they have no greater sense of a bigger story. We've told ourselves we can be our own God, but we're not up to the task. I'm not up to the task of being the God over me. If I'm honest with myself, I'm horrified at who I am, and who am I to forgive myself? I have no moral authority or standing that I can forgive my own sins. I need the God of the universe to do that. I don't know why he bothers in my case, but miraculously he does. And in jettisoning that, and in look at that sort of bigger story, that bigger picture, the idea that we find ourselves by surrendering ourselves to a greater being rather than looking inward with all of our inadequacies, must be exacerbating mental health problems and unhappiness for many people. And we do know that anxiety and depression and self-harm are rife amongst our children. We also know that our abandonment, I suppose, in many ways, I think we overparent, but in some ways we underparent. And we've made a terrible blunder with our children and allowing them to basically become addicted to phone time, not playtime. We do know that. The boys go down the road of games and porn and what have you, and the girls go down the road of, what would you call it, social competitiveness? Who goes to the most parties? Who's beautiful? Why am I not accepted? And it's producing disastrous mental health outcomes amongst young people in all Western countries. In fact, the graph is the same in all Western countries, and it all particularly accelerated with the advent of smartphones.
I thought this question was really interesting, and there is a few questions that talk about the comparison between the UK and USA compared to Australia in terms of where we're at. But John says he's been an ACL supporter for many years and has been looking at similar politics in other Western nations, particularly in the USA, which is the only country, in his opinion, that is pushing back on some of the woke policies, such as the reversal of abortion laws. But over there's a strong movement on Christian nationalism, basically training Christians to be politicians. And his question is there any other way than Christian nationalism that can achieve this outcome?
It's a very good question. And I'm going to say, I think I'd probably need more time to think about that. I am a believer in patriotism, and I'm a believer in nation states. I actually think we do need, I'm against identity politics, but I do think we do need to identify, it's the Old Testament model of subsidiarity, where we should do for ourselves what we can do for ourselves, and for our neighbours what we should do for ourselves, and we only push it up to the extent that we can't do it better for ourselves. And we shouldn't ask government to do things that we can do better for ourselves in particular. But we ought to identify together with those around us on a community level, broader community out to a national level. I think that's actually quite important for freedom. And I also think the idea of doing away with national boundaries, which is the opposite of this sort of nationalism, it's do away with them, fluid boundaries. That's why the Democrats in America have let in 10 million people through their southern borders, uncontrolled. They don't know who they are. They don't know who's amongst them. The American people hate it. It will be probably the biggest issue in the presidential election, according to the polls over there. that approach, I think, is a complete failure. It ignores the problem of the flawed and sinful nature of human beings and the reality that you ask people of ill intent to come into your midst, disruptors, people who bring ancient hatreds, what have you, into your midst. Now, Christian nationalism as a term, no, we're about heavenly allegiance. I think in the end, we've got to keep that in mind. And our primary commitment is to our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, notwithstanding that I think it's important that as an Australian, I think Australia matters, and I'm a patriotic Australian. I wish we were all patriotic, and I want our nation state to succeed.
Great. Some people are commenting on what's happening in schools, in education, woke ideology, and that being leading towards the quickening of this social decline that we're seeing. Yep. What do you think needs to be instilled in terms of values education to, I suppose, bring our young people and our children back to a proper understanding of their identity and their personal responsibility?
How long have we got? The Long March Through the Left, which is a term invented by a leader of the left in America in 1969, began really with the universities. And out of the universities now has poured this poisonous mindset that rejects Christianity and says, no, morality is really based around the simplistic and stupid notion of victor and victim, or oppressor and oppressed. And always it's white people who are the oppressors. The evidence is always that they predominate. Well, no, that really has to do with the roots of their civilization giving rise to peaceful cooperation and economic success. That's the problem. Everybody actually wants those good things, and they need to understand the well springs of them and not demonize them as evidence that white people are oppressors. Some white people are, but then I've seen some people of other skin colors who aren't very nice as well. So we've had this long march through the left, and those academics have now managed to poison many minds. The passing of the greatest generation, especially in America, which is the cultural leadership of the West, but we had the greatest generation here too. The Americans, when they talk the greatest generation, mean those people who were born between 1900 and probably 1930, who saw America and the free world through the Great Depression, the Second World War, Korea, the Cold War, and into, if you like, the collapse of the Berlin Wall and communism, or so we thought, in 1989 or 90. And they started to leave the workplace and academia in the 1990s, and that left a terrible void. We need to understand we have left a void. They left a void, and good people have left a void. And I hear all the time, I hear serious people say, I'm leaving my workplace at the university or school or whatever, because there's just no place now for someone of my views. That's terrible. The pushback. Well, here's an amazing thing. I understand that Britain's classroom outcomes have started to improve. Ours are still in free fall, led by New South Wales, as I understand it, I might add. Parents should be demanding better. We should be rewarding teachers more broadly. We need politicians who actually take on departments of education and do something about the curriculum, and then educate teachers to teach better. And we need to remember this. This came out of ARC. A very wise Swedish academic said to me, what we've done in the classroom is destroy the notion of truth. Everything's relative. Mm-hmm. So instead of saying, well, that's an objective fact, and we know from history that that is true, or we know from maths or science or whatever that is true, it all seems to be up for grabs. So, Michelle, you might believe something's true, and I might believe something else is true. That is absolutely hopeless. And it leads to a situation where you cannot speak principle, you cannot speak truth to power, because the power just says, oh, that's your opinion, it's not truth. That's just your truth. And the only alternative left is what we're now seeing, the struggle for power. You're going to match power with power. You can't match it with principle. Well, democracies are based on principles. They're based on the four freedoms. They're all principles that speak to power. We own, in theory, the freedom to conscience of belief and freedom of conscience and belief. We own our right to speak freely. We own the right to assemble freely. We own our property, including our intellectual property, which we can sell for a profit so that we can live and not have it taken away, snatched away by somebody else. And we surrender only such of those freedoms as are needed for the common good or for facing an emergency. And then losing sight of that in handing over to government powers they shouldn't have, we are imperiling ourselves, and we can no longer speak truth to power. This is a massive problem.
You no longer speak truth to power, because what is truth? I was listening to one of your podcasts, and one of your guests said the age of reason has become the age of unreason. We're on shaky foundations. And I'm sure that it frustrates you like nothing else to see the way that activists, organisations has infiltrated the public sector and influencing legislation. And there's a question from Tyler who says, for many issues, there seems to be a strange and problematic partnership between the very left or centre Labor state governments and the federal government, partnering together with highly problematic activist organisations such as OzPath, which is connected to WPATH, and ACON, amongst others. Governments then offer community consultation, and this is overwhelmed by their own sponsors, activist organisations. I mean, so true. We see this all the time. The activist organisations often get special access to legislation formation and then overwhelm normal voices from the community and smaller groups. Do you see any way that this can be addressed or successfully countered for the benefit of the wider public and vulnerable people who are not well served by this stitch up? It's such a good question, and we experience this all the time, seeing how the activist organisations operate through things like the Australian Human Rights Commissions, the Equal Opportunities Commissions, the Law Reform Commissions, and it's difficult to have any other voice heard, and then that ends up influencing legislation. How do we work against this?
Well, yeah, it is a very good question, and it's absolutely true, and you see it happening all the time. And I find it goes to the very heart of what I was just talking about. Truth doesn't seem to matter. It's all about power games, and a lot of that power, you know, they're clever enough to use it in very dishonest ways that are very hard to pin and very hard to expose. But draw some heart. I mean, many of the problems we're talking about now, I think have been exacerbated by the new atheist movement. It's dead. It's gone. It's finished. Nobody talks new atheism anymore. I mean, even Richard Dawkins has been saying he's now a civilisational Christian. I understand one of his family is now a regular at a good solid church in London. That you can look at. Justin Brearley has just put together a very interesting podcast on the number of highly significant academics who and thought leaders who have moved away from their new atheism, hard atheism, to at least a willingness to say Christianity is critical of our civilizations to survive. And in some cases, Ayaan Hirsi Ali being one, Neil Ferguson's wife, to actually embracing Christianity. And you've seen this happen a bit. Why do I mention that in the context of this? Tides do turn. You're seeing, I think, peak woke in many ways. As Wendy Francis put it, you know, even now at this late moment, like I'm tempted to say the way the Nazis continued to put people into the death camps, even when it was obvious they'd completely lost the war. And you have governments still trying to cling to their last powers. But there is community pushback. The transgender thing is a high watermark. It's starting to turn. People are saying, this is just nuts. You got to turn back from this. And on the issue of this sort of covert operations, I noticed Nick Cater, who's a very clear thinker, he's been writing about who's funding who in the zoo and the lack of transparency and so forth. And if any of you have any sort of resources or journalistic or investigative skills or know people who do, this is a very rich area for us to explore. We need to start to insist on transparency. Everybody expects transparency for everybody else, but the double standards are breathtaking. I mean, we talked, you know, I heard again from some of the state reports that this attempt to deny charities and schools the right to hire as they choose. Show me the political leader who will apply the same principles. Would Adam Brandt like me on as his chief advisor? But if you were to have an absolutely non-discriminatory policy, the way they want to impose it on others, of course he would. Oh, John, come on in. You disagree with us on everything, but we won't discriminate against you. And, you know, when I was Deputy Prime Minister, I chose people who supported my vision of where we ought to go, who created an ecosystem where we pursued best possible policy. And then the people judged, as they ought to, on whether that was right or not at an election. That was the right way to do it. It wasn't for them to say, now you must have, you know, 0.1 of a Green in your office and 0.2 of a Liberal and 0.3 of a Calathumpian, and you must have an X number of atheists and what have. I mean, that's totalitarianism in itself. It's what it is. It's totalitarianism.
Yeah. I like this question because it does talk about the focus on self and what we need to do to address it. And he says, I was engaged to perform maintenance work at a kindergarten in Melbourne. I was shocked by the number of posters which promoted self. The focus on me from such a young age is frightening, even to the way the ADF recruits is focused on self. We seem to have lost the will to serve. We must demonstrate a willingness to serve others and place them above ourselves. Mr. Anderson, thank you for your willingness to serve our nation. Could you please share some thoughts and encouragement for us to seek to serve?
Well, thank you for the question and thank you for the compliment. I'm sure I'll go to my grave thinking I should have done more and regretting the mistakes I've made and the times when I've said, oh, that's too hard, or I'll just wimp out of this one. But I am committed to trying to do what I can. The observation you've made is absolutely right. We're destroying our kids by pretending them that they can present for themselves a big enough story in which they are their own God. They will arbitrate over every matter pertaining to their life. Their body is theirs, their life is theirs, their soul is theirs. They can do with it as they like. They can forgive themselves their sins. It doesn't work. We're not up to the task of being God. It denies the very concept of sinfulness. We desperately need recognizing from ourselves. And the great and extraordinary thing about Christianity that to me makes it so much a story that rings true is that it offers an explanation for the worth and the dignity and the magnificence of the people around me and for their flawed inclination to be sinful. You know, man is, you know, the glory of the universe and the scum of the earth. I think that's what Blaise Pascal said. And, you know, Solzhenitsyn, you know, said, if only it was so simple, the problem of evil. If all we had to do was to get rid of evil people, and there'd be no more evil. But of course, we can't do it because which of us is going to cut out that part of their own heart that is evil? That's every one of us, every single one of us. So you're absolutely right. We're destroying our kids. And by the way, one of the products of this selfishness is that we don't forgive others. No, the Bible's very big. The Bible is a story of redemption through forgiveness, unmerited favor, Christ on the cross. Once we do away with forgiveness in our personal relationships, they come shattering down. They collapse. And the same can be applied to a culture. And one of the reasons, going back to anxiety, we know that our children are so anxious, is that they live in this judgmental culture. You know, only a few short years ago, there was this brief window where the great motto was tolerance. Don't judge others. Be kind to everybody. Be tolerant of everything and everyone. We now live in the new age of absolutism. If you don't fall into line with the current thinking, you will not be forgiven. You'll be ostracized. You'll be cancelled. And I asked Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, what happens to a culture when forgiveness is forgotten? And he said, well, your only hope is that people will forget. But in the social media age, of course, they don't forget. On the military, I was really picked up. Petty Jim's not here. So some fascinating things happening in America as they've started to get serious. Oh, that we would in this country about the dangers fronting us. They've dropped some of that recruiting material. And now they use things like high quality games. I mean, we know games can be very bad for our kids, but high quality games, which do appeal to a sense of bravery, courage, service, you know, serve your nation in the military. And it's producing surges of fine young men who want to step up. Those instincts haven't gone away. We can still appeal to the best. And we need to be out there, I think, looking for that. Never forget, that's my Churchill and the young people's story in the 1930s. He believed profoundly that given the right leadership, people would step up. And that's what you're all about tonight. Hundreds of you. I can't believe I'm talking to hundreds of people from here in now slightly chilly northwest New South Wales, the little town of Malali, or near the town of Malali. Isn't that incredible? But you're here because you're wanting to serve, encourage others to serve. So just say to them, it's so hard now talking to some people because they get so angry, oh, don't talk to me about climate change. I feel so strongly, I'll get emotional. I'll just have to walk away from the table. Good grief. I can't believe that people think that's an acceptable way to behave. But one of the, we must get better at questioning. And one of the things that I think you can say is, you can say to people, don't you think we're becoming self-centered? Wouldn't it be better if we served? Wouldn't it be better if we saw the people around us as people, not trees? And I think you can draw the better angels out if we go about it the right way.
Absolutely. And culture isn't completely lost. And there's still that part of the human heart that we can speak to. And it's just in saying things like that, like you said, serve versus self, and make people aware that there is a distinction. And then it helps them to think about it and become better people as a result. And as I talk to people that don't know God about the gender issue, they're on our side in terms of they don't want their kids being exposed to gender ideology in schools. They're not happy with the way that activists have infiltrated the institutions. So we've got to get out there and speak and activate people so that they have their voice heard, because as we say, it's the silent majority. But we can make a real difference. And thank you for that encouragement tonight, John. We really appreciate your time. Appreciate you being available. And you said hundreds. I reckon there's probably about 1,200, 1,300 people actually watching, with multiple people on screens. So Jesus did it with 12, and the amount of people in this room can certainly make a huge impact on our nation. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it. If everybody in the room was here, they could, in person, they would applaud you, and we would hear a loud applause. It's always challenging to balance the reality of the current world in which we live, but also how our heart breaks for the injustice that's all around us, as we said before, the babies that are aborted, the sexualization of our children, the rising levels of antagonism, the vitriol that we're seeing in the left and the right. Yet there's something within us as Christians that, despite the current reality, we are firmly grounded in eternity. So we know that this isn't all there is, and we know that eternity is actually our current reality. So we can't get lost in the depression, the despondency, the discouragement of the now, because we actually live with an eternal perspective. And so we're on this journey to kingdom come, and that actually gives us great hope.